States to vote by popular vote to outlaw Catholic schools. Why do they want to outlaw Catholic schools? Because they're mostly immigrants, Italians and Irish. And they thought, well, they'd already taken away booze, which they wanted to get rid of. The Klan was huge behind Prohibition. They think if we take away their meeting places, their pubs, and if we take away their social lubricant, we'll be able to diminish them. Similarly with the schools. They thought, where do immigrants learn to be Americans? In the schools, so we take away the Catholic schools. But the story took me first to Colorado, where they had a Klan governor who ran under the slogan, every man under the Capitol Dome a Klansman. And then, once he was elected, he proceeded to try to fire every Jew, every Catholic, and every African American working for the state of Colorado. Stapleton Airport was named for a Klansman who was the mayor of Denver. But then the story took me further east to the heartland of the United States, where 1 in 3 white males in the 1920s put their hand on a Bible and swore out an oath to belong to America's oldest domestic terror group. So that's why I ended up in Indiana.
And the numbers were, 1 in 3 is pretty amazing, but the total number, the range is anywhere from 5 to 8 million.
Well, I want Steve to jump in on this because of Harry Truman's brief association there, but correct. In the Klan's peak, which was 100 years ago this year, 1924, there were 6 million members of this terror group. 6 million. They had 4 governors. They had at least 4 United States senators. They had 75 members of the House of Representatives, not the State House, the United States House. They had governor of Indiana, governor of Colorado, governor of Oregon, senator from Texas. And they were so instrumental in the 1924 political conventions of both Republicans and Democrats that Time magazine put the head Klansman on their cover and wrote a largely laudatory story about how influential they were at these conventions. They couldn't even condemn the Klan at either of these conventions by vote. So they were at their peak. And they were on their way from 6 billion to 12 billion, and they had a plan to put a man in the White House. And if you think that's preposterous, you're not reading our history correctly. And that man was this awful man who's at the center of my story, which I'll get into.
So Steve, do you want to comment on Truman's?
Sure. There's a great line in the opening chapter of your book, Tim, that basically says if you weren't in the Klan in 1925, you were nobody. And probably one of the rare blunders in his long political life, Truman, at a certain point, as he was rerunning for county judge, like a county commissioner in Missouri, it was clear he was liable to lose because the Klan had such support. He handed over his $10 and agreed to join the Klan. He later met with the recruiting person to sign him up or whatever. The discussion was not about black people, but it was about Catholics. And Truman, a combat veteran of World War I, had represented in his artillery battery something like 491 men, many of whom were Irish Catholics from Kansas City, and he realized this. Truman should have known better, and it's a rare blot on his public life. He should have known better, but at this point he withdrew, he took his money back, and so it's a blot on his long public life, but it was right in the middle of this pressure to talk about it. I was going to ask you, Tim, too, about this march down Washington, and what is it, 1925 or something, like 60,000 people?
It was 24, the peak year again. And they had 50,000 Klansmen march from the Capitol Dome to the Treasury Building in broad daylight. And the Washington Post was astonished. Both New York Times and Washington Post, front page story, Klan stages huge rally. But when they interviewed most of these people, they weren't rubes from the South. They were community stakeholders, the people who held their communities together in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and primarily Indiana. They were from the North. They were hard pressed to find the stereotypical Klansman. One more thing on what you just brought up. There were some people, and I'll get into this later, who did try to push back. Although our guardrails of democracy were pretty battered during this period. You think they're being battered now? They were really battered in 1924, 100 years ago. But one of them was a crusading Irish-American newspaper man who'd come from Ireland, where his family had been persecuted by the Brits for 800 years, and suddenly he's the enemy. The Irish-Americans are the enemy, and their clans, say, get rid of these Catholics and all that. So he started this newspaper with blacks and Jews called tolerance. And what they did is they had insiders in these clan tents, and they give them the names of all the prominent people in your community who belonged to this. Remember, it was a secret society. You swore this oath, and you weren't supposed to tell anyone who belonged. And so they once a week you'd print a story under the headline, "Who's Who in Bed Sheets." And there would be this long list, and he said, this will do it, this will kill him, this will shame him. It was the opposite. It was validating. People would read these lists and go, oh, I know him, he's my banker, this person was coached my kids, and here's the minister. A lot of Protestant ministers were bribed to preach hatred from the pulpit, to hate your fellow neighbor. So, I can understand Truman. There was a lot of pressure to belong.
For me, Truman would later integrate the U.S. military. He would make civil rights a priority of his presidential administration. But here's a guy who grew up in Missouri in the 1880s, which was not, many of the people he encountered were Civil War veterans on the South. Lynching in his young days was talked about openly in the press and celebrated. And so, part of what I'm writing about in my story is watching Truman shed a lot of his upbringing and learning. As a county judge and commissioner, he realized he had black constituents. He realized he would never drop his personal bigotry, but he did realize that black people were citizens, they deserved equal treatment of the law, and that was the formation of that. So this period that I wrote about, it was I couldn't pretend he was the Truman he became later as president, but nor was he the same person he had been as a young man.
So let's talk about the Truman.
Yeah.
We were talking about. The Truman Commission was established after beginning of World War II.
Right.
To look into the fraud and corruption that was going on between basically the Pentagon and defense contractors around the country.
Right.
Ford Motor Company, Kaiser Steel, U.S. Steel.
Name a big defense corporation. Sure. So, okay, how to start off. Truman had been elected to the Senate in 1934. For 6 years, he did virtually nothing there. He was, without question, one of the least known politicians in Washington. There's a great quote from the Washington Post in my story that says, if you had asked anybody in the country who the senator from Missouri were, they would have named the Maine senator and some other guy, that's what Truman found he narrowly won re-election in 1940 in a race in which Franklin Roosevelt, among others, favored his opponent, Lloyd Stark, who was the former governor of the state and also a strong segregationist. It was one of the reasons Truman won was that the black newspapers by this time had swung saying they had a far worse candidate to support. He narrowly won re-election. He took a break in November of that year. He came back to Washington, and at this time, 1940, war has been raging in Europe since September 1939. Franklin Roosevelt and others knew that the United States would inevitably and eventually get drawn into this war. Once again, as always happens in our history, the United States found itself, in 1939, ranked 17th in the world in the size of its army, behind Romania. So here we are again, as in World War I, as in the Civil War, scrambling to get ready for a giant war. And so Roosevelt was pushing through defense bills against opposition in the Congress, but we needed army camps, new ships for the Navy, new airplanes, everything. And it was happening real fast. And big million and billion-dollar contracts were being led, or bills were passing Congress. Truman came back to his office and he was getting letters from some of his constituents in Missouri. Hey, Senator, there was an army camp being built in the Ozarks called Fort Leonard Wood. Hey, Senator, something's funny is going on here. There's a lot of waste going on here. Truman, one of the great things about Truman, and it makes him a fun guy to write about, he didn't send a staffer out to check it out. He did not get on a plane with a congressional delegation and all of his aides and show up. Truman walked out of his apartment one day in January 1941. It's right on Connecticut Avenue. I used to live right across the street. He walked out of his apartment, he got in his car, and he drove to Missouri.
He did a lot of that.
He did. Truman loved a road trip. He showed up at this army camp, no senatorial fanfare, a little very well-dressed guy in a double-breasted suit and a hat, walking around asking questions. And he saw what the letters had said. He saw guys sitting around drawing a paycheck for nothing. He saw giant piles of lumber and materials going to waste. He saw contractors soaking the government for 3 or 4 times what they should be earning. And he kept going from there, and he visited a bunch of other construction sites and army camps. He came back to Washington hopping mad. And he got up on the floor of the Senate in February 10th, 1941, and he proposed an investigating committee that would look into this. But think about it. A Democratic senator proposing to investigate the administration of a president, a very popular president of his own party. Nobody in Washington thought this was a good idea, certainly not Franklin Roosevelt, until it became clear that if a Democrat didn't do it, Republicans were more than happy to take on this investigation. The Senate gave Truman, they tossed him a bone. $15,000 appropriation, said, sure, here, have your little committee. That was barely enough to hire a lawyer and a couple of secretaries at that time. Truman took that tiny appropriation, he turned it into the most powerful investigating arm that Congress had seen, and it led directly to him becoming a national figure and to him becoming vice president 3 years later, and 90 days after that, president of the United States. And it was a lot of fun story to talk.
And this is well before Dwight Eisenhower coined the term
Yeah.
military-industrial complex, where he warned about.
Right, and you can see this thing happening where the government needed stuff. There was just no concern. One of Truman's arch enemies, a general named Brahon Somerville, who built the Pentagon, Truman said of him, he'll get the job done, but he doesn't care a damn about the money. That was basically the attitude in wartime Washington, and Truman saw billions going to waste.
What about the ship, the
Sure.
Schenectady?
I begin my story with a night in January 1943, a brand new, so shipyards were being built all across the country. One of the most pressing needs was merchant ships and oil tankers that would take materials across the ocean to Britain. Britain stood alone against the Nazis but needed a lot of help. And the big challenge was having enough merchant ships to carry food, weapons, munitions, men across the ocean faster than the German submarines could sink them. So merchant ships were being built. There was a brand new one sitting in its mooring in Portland, Oregon on the night of January 16th. A sound broke out. You could hear it a mile away. The earthquake, the FBI, fire, everyone raced to the scene thinking, of course, this was wartime sabotage. Nobody was hurt. A seaman broke his ankle jumping off the ship, but nobody was hurt. But there's a picture in my story. You can see a 543-foot long ship, brand new, cost $3 million. And it looks like a giant picked it up and snapped it like that and set it gently back down in the water. For 3 months, nobody knew what the heck happened here. And a big part of my story is how the Truman Committee uncovered what happened to the ship, what happened at the steel mill where they were shipping a United States steel factory in Pittsburgh, shipping tons of bad steel to the Navy, to the Merchant Marines, to the British Navy, all the time. This was one of the signature investigations of the Truman Committee that led to, again, finding himself on the front page of every paper in the country. He was on that same week that this story broke, he was on the cover of Time magazine. The headline said, "A democracy needs to keep an eye on itself." And this was one of the direct things that led to him becoming president.
Tim, tell us about Mr. Stevenson.
Certainly wasn't as involved soul as very true. This is a truly awful man. D.C. Stevens was a monster. He was the Grand Dragon of the largest Klan state in our history, Indiana, who ruled the state. At one point he said, "I am the law." And he was the law. He raped several women and nothing ever happened. Cops would come investigate it. They'd show each other their Klan cards. And a lot of members of the police departments were Klansmen. A lot of prosecutors were Klansmen. A lot of judges were Klansmen. Most legislators belonged to the secret society. So he was the law. And he was a classic American character. He was a drifter who deserted his wife and baby child in Oklahoma and just washed up in Evansville, Indiana, right across from the Ohio River. And within 4 years, he's running the state. He had the gift of gab. He said things people wanted to hear. He was a charmer. He also said things that made people realize their fears weren't theirs alone. He had a really good gift of taking this sort of nervous energy about American society. All these Jews coming, these blacks moving north, these women liberating, and packaging it in a sort of central package of hate so that you could blame others. It was also the peak of the eugenics movement. And Indiana was the first state to pass a law allowing them to involuntarily sterilize women of ill repute. That is, women were promiscuous. If you go to civil trial, you're found to be promiscuous, they could, prevent you from ever having children. A whole
On the books until 1970.
in many different states followed it, and I don't ever bring up Nazi comparisons, but the Germans did say their model for their eugenics law was the Indiana law, that showed them how to get rid of all the undesirables they wanted. So Stevenson is a master manipulator, a con man. I call him a music man of hate. We got trouble right here in River City. He would show up in this town and he'd say, Indiana was a homogenous place. Very few blacks, very few Jews. Even the Catholic population wasn't great, and certainly not a lot of immigrants, but it was out there. They're coming. This other is coming. This great job of sort of packaging fear, anxiety, and hatred about a changing America. And then he did this thing really brilliantly. First of all, he had his own private police force. 30,000 men, legally deputized to go into those speakeasies and harass women and, firebomb churches. They had their own badges. They were called the Horse Thief Detectives Association. And they didn't have any stolen horses they were going after. This is a group that had been authorized by Indiana in the 1850s, and they just were still around. And he co-opted them, made him this private police force. Number two, this is very important. The Klan was sanctified from the pulpit on Sunday. He got all these Protestant ministers. He bribed them. He realized they were a pretty cheap bribe. He'd give most of them no more than $100. And then they would preach on Sunday morning the virtues of the Ku Klux Klan. And before you know it, he had hundreds of ministers on his payroll sanctifying it, giving it a spiritual gloss. It's not a hate group. We're a group, where Jesus himself would be a member. Well, he was a Jew, of course. What's that problem? He was one of the people who tried to argue that Jesus wasn't a Jew. So he had a private police force, he sanctified it, and then he also had a really interesting thing. We think we live in the age of misinformation now, which we do. And it's the number one, I think, threat to democracy right now is misinformation. But even back then, in a simpler technology age, he had this gossip group where he could plant a rumor from the northern part of the state that somebody living in the southern part of the state was a Jew. And they boycotted Jews. They would read the names of the Jewish owners in Indiana, have a boycott. And he boasted that I could plant the rumor at 9 o'clock and everyone in the state would know about it by the end of the day. And what it was a sort of Cluck brigade of women. And they carried out his, this poison gossip. And so he was able to get misinformation out. So he very skillfully, now, this is the story of these American con men. He was preaching chastity. He was preaching the virtue of womanhood, that we've got these pure white women, can't ever be involved with sex. And he was a raging sexual predator who assaulted and raped numerous women. He was preaching, because remember, the Klan's one of their number one things, total abstinence of alcohol. Banning it, as I said, they outlawed hair tonic. And he was a raging alcoholic and bootlegger who would have these parties in his mansion in Indianapolis, attended by judges and politicians, and it was the best booze in town. He talked about virtues of America. He says, we believe in the truth, we tell the truth. This guy told 20 lies before noon. I always get asked that. My friend Kim Burns says that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes.
I'm sorry. You have a quote that the hate is always there for the tapping. And that's true today.
It's sad. And you who've read my other books should know I am an optimist. I'm a believer in the American experiment, this really sometimes tenuous thing we've put together here where we're not tribal, we're not based on one religion. That was the genius of our Constitution, was we wouldn't be faith-based. They were rejecting what they'd done in Europe. They had a state and church were one. I'm a great believer in that experiment, but it was hanging by the threads there because of guys like Stevenson showing how quickly it could be shredded. That really, so where was the press? A lot of reporters were Klansmen. A lot of editors were Klansmen. One brave crusading editor, a guy named George Dale of Muncie, Indiana, attacked this judge for being a Klansman and holding a show trial. The judge calls him before into his chambers and throws him in jail and sends him to a penal farm without a trial. The First Amendment did not apply in the state of Indiana. You have every right in the First Amendment to criticize the judge, especially if what you're saying is true. He couldn't sue for life, but they threw this guy in jail. So he made an example. So he hit D.C. Stevenson iron grip control of the state, and everyone thought he was sort of a benign presence. He called himself the old man, and as time went on, he was like the Wizard of Oz. He wouldn't be seen. He would issue these proclamations. The old man has spoken. He's only 33 years old. And he would just issue this proclamation from the Klan newspaper, which had a circulation of 200,000 in Indiana. And so he had iron grip control and just shredded the Constitution. And everybody knew about it. This is what's so crazy about this story. Open any newspaper from the 1920s in the Midwest, and you'll see the story about the Klan. Now, often it's a positive story. Noblesville, Indiana, where my story ends up, there's a trial. Had a regular feature every Sunday called Klan Comment, K-L-A-N-C-O-K-O-M, yeah. And it was just little homilies about how great it was to hate all these other people. It's just amazing. Then they'd say, and our picnic will be at 2 o'clock today. They had a Klan gathering in Kokomo, Indiana. I went there, lovely town out in the prairie, cornfields at the edge, has everything you look for in small town America. Largest rally in the history of the Klan, 200,000 people. 200,000 people turned out in Kokomo on the 4th of July to welcome D.C. Stevenson as he descended in his biplane. Yeah.
KKK logo.
KKK logo underneath. Gets out in his splendid robes, says, "Welcome, fellow Klansmen." They all bow down and they start throwing money at him. And he has this speech where he says our Constitution could be improved, if only he had a rewrite. And then, after all these verities, after all these homilies to the good Christian people in the midst, that night in Kokomo, Indiana, he rapes a girl. And she's afraid she doesn't go to the police, but it's another example of what he could do to get away. So I sort of saw the metaphor of, while Indiana and much of the Midwest, and much of the United States was really sick. That's what I call it, a fever. They were just sick with hatred. This man who's controlling it becomes ever more awful. He goes from being a liar, a con man, an alcoholic, a bootlegger, to being a rapist, a murderer, and a cannibal. He's just one of the most awful human beings. So I just sold this book to a film producer and I'm like, is this guy Hannibal Lecter? I mean, how do you portray him?
So Steve, how about talking about some American citizens that did the right thing and wrote some letters to...
This was one of the funner part of the stories. Early on, Truman had started his committee. He went on the radio. Truman, at this time, was always a terrible public speaker, a pretty poor one. But he went on the radio and basically said, hey, we started up this committee in Washington, and we need your help, America. If you see something going on down at the factory, something wrong at the shipyard, you have an idea for winning the war, send me a letter, write to me, Harry Truman, Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. Initially, people responded, a few. By the end of the war, 100 of these letters were coming in a day to the Truman Committee, and many of them were what Truman liked to call crackpots. Basically, I'll tell you, Truman's favorite story was a guy he encountered who had a plan to win the war. And that plan was to give every American soldier a personal airplane. And at a given moment, all of those airplanes would be filled up with dirt And all the soldiers would take off and they would fly over Tokyo and Berlin and drop and bury those cities under US Truman told this story till the end of the life he loved it. I've held in my hands many of these thousands of letters that people wrote to them, and many of them were kind of that nature. Some people were saying, hey, like the ones that started the investigation, actually the steel investigation I meant. There was an inspector at the steel plant in Pittsburgh, and he started writing to Truman in March of 1942, hey, something was going on down here. The problem was his letters were dense, they were full of jargon. I've read them, you can barely understand them, but eventually, when it became clear what had made this ship broke apart, everybody in the Truman Committee was gobsmacked because they had been getting letters from a guy at this very factory saying bad steel was coming out of this place every day.
What about the Higgins boat?
Sure, there's another example. Andrew Jackson Higgins. So we've all seen the movie. The soldiers are going ashore at D-Day or at some Pacific island. Tom Hanks is in the boat sometimes. And they're going ashore, the ramp comes down, and all the men run off. That, I didn't know until I wrote this book, was called a Higgins boat. And a very entrepreneurial boat inventor named Andrew Jackson Higgins in New Orleans had invented this simple boat that Dwight Eisenhower credited as a major tool of winning the war. The problem was the Navy had a boat of its own design and that its own staff had designed and much preferred. Andrew Jackson Higgins was brash, he was a bit of a jerk, and he rubbed the Navy people the wrong way. He could not get an audience in Washington. He went to Truman and said, hey, help me out here, my design is a lot better. Truman had a great idea, and he said to the Navy, take this guy's boat and your boat, put a 30-ton tank on them, and run them through choppy water and see what happens. So this test happened in Norfolk, Virginia, off Norfolk, in early 1942. Higgins's boat, each boat was loaded with a 30-ton tank. Higgins's boat sailed, landed its boat on the beach, and then sailed back to circle around the Navy boat, which was And this sounds funny, and we laugh, but the Navy had ordered 900 of these boats, and without this boat, and without the Truman Committee's intervention, that would have been the boat that carried countless soldiers on shores in Pacific Islands or at Normandy in June 1944. So it's one of the most direct examples of the Truman Committee intervening to help win the war.
I want to just follow real quickly on that. It's a funny story about dropping the dirt. When I was researching my Dust Bowl book, I found some similar things. They were hearing about these horrible storms that were sending essentially mountains of sand, a mile high, in some cases 100 miles wide. Just looked like the Rocky Mountains on the move, dumping all the sand. Some of it hit New York City, which really upset people. That's when they finally realized they had a problem. Right. And people started writing these letters, where they said, why don't we send, this is from the East Coast, why don't we send all our junk cars to the Dust Bowl, and that'll hold the sand down.
There's a guy, Tim, who proposed, there's a letter in the files, who proposed, there was a giant rubber shortage, which one of the things the Truman Committee did, shortages of aluminum. Who was going to get steel? Chrysler Corporation to build tanks, or the Navy to build a new battleship, or Henry Kaiser out west to go. There were huge questions of shortages and resources. One man proposed the way you solve the rubber shortage was to scrape the highways of America and pick up all the rubber that had worn away from the fire. I'm telling these funny stories, but I thought I would read one of the letters from, this is from a woman, this is from a man named John Duggan Jr. who lived in Connecticut, and he wrote a letter to Truman after the week the steel investigation broke. 2 weeks later, on March 27, 1943, John Duggan wrote this letter to Truman. My dear Senator Truman, on behalf of myself, and I'm sure millions of other fathers who have boys in actual combat service, I want to congratulate you and your committee on the wonderful public service you have rendered the nation. I have 2 sons, a brother and a son-in-law in the combat forces of the nation. 2 are at present overseas, and the others will probably go in due time. It's one hell of a situation when you and myself and millions of others who have boys risking their lives are compelled to submit to a thing of this sort, that additional profits might fall into the coffers of the steel company. Stay in there and pitch, Senator. You and your committee have done a swell job. Very respectfully yours, John Duggan Jr. And Pete, there are hundreds of these letters in the files, and it was one of the things that really kind of made me feel like, oh, maybe there's a book to write here.
Yeah, good idea. So,
Yeah.
Tim, I want to talk more about Mr. Stevenson and the influence that he had on the people that he was using, mostly the politicians in the state and in the area, and his desire to, at some point in his mind, become the president of the United States.
So he had a special power. When putting this book together, I was trying to answer the why question, not just tell the story well and truthfully and honestly so that people can see and learn from this episode, but the why, which I'm not sure I successfully answered it, but this was my conclusion. He had no shame. He had no bottom. And people who are willing to go there, he learned really early on as a little kid in what we now call junior high. He would grab a little girl's breast and do it in front of everyone, and he got away with it. Then when he was 12, he started carrying a gun, shooting and something. And he ditched his first wife and their newborn child and said, don't even try to find me. He just showed up somewhere else and said he was a single man. So he gradually just got away with this stuff. He was a sociopath, had no conscience, clearly. But the fact that he had no bottom, that was his superpower. That nothing, he was willing to go there where no one else would go. And I think everyone in this room has a little pang of conscience, at least I like to think so, when you do something wrong. But there are people who can kill a cat and not feel anything. And he was one of those people, and that was one of his powers. Now, I'll go back real quickly. That gossip brigade he had, I just remember, it was called his poison squad. That's what he called it. He said, I have poison squads all over the state. I can plan a rumor, and my poison squad will send it everywhere it goes. So he also had a little dirt on people. So he would get stuff, he had these people gather information, so he had things. But it mainly was just this bundling their fears and hatreds in a plausible enough manner. And as he went on and raped women and got away with it, that also just led to a superpower. That you just think, God, look, he can do it. So he would throw these debauched parties, just blowout parties at his mansion. And the people who attended were judges, ministers, and politicians, and naked women would pop out of cakes and he would sign them to different, the president of Wonder Bread, which was invented in Indianapolis, was one of the people who attended his parties. He was the biggest guy in Indiana. And to this day, they swear he didn't even exist. I mean, they've just written him out of it. They just practiced collective amnesia. So it's unbelievable. He doesn't even rate an asterisk in history, in Indiana history. Now that's changing. I was in Indiana for much of November. I went to Kokomo to read and speak. I went to all these places where I've been. Spent a lot of time researching the book, and I got wonderful crowds and people. And this, everybody's talked about this a lot too. We have this debate about our history right now. Can we teach the bad parts, or can we not handle teaching the bad parts? I think the bad parts, knowing about the bad parts, make us stronger. Thank you. That's exactly what I found in Indiana, was that we had huge crowds like this, and they were embracing the story. They said, I'm not afraid of this. Maybe my grandpa was in the Klan, but I need to understand that. It can't just be a smiley button version of history.
There's a lot going on in those cornfields out in Indiana. So one thing that struck me, though, was the white telephone. The one thing that struck me was the white telephone that he had in his office.
Yeah, he had 12 telephones in his office in downtown Indianapolis, 2 blocks from the Capitol. And one of them was all black, except one of them was white. And he'd say, that's a direct line to the White House. And he'd make people wait outside so he could hear it. He'd go, well, President Coolidge, give my best to Mrs. Coolidge. Oh, it's so wonderful. I heard you were up in Maine last weekend. And everyone thought he had this direct line to the president. Now, I didn't answer your last question. I'll get back to it right now. Here was the plan. Indiana's, one of their two senators was very ill, and he was gonna die, and he did die. Then the governor, who was a Klansman, and owed his governorship to D.C. Stevenson, this con man, would name D.C. Stevenson the United States Senator in 1924. And then Steve's plan was, in 28, he'd run for president. They had 6 million Klansmen, they dominated the national conventions, and they thought, just give me 4 years in the Senate, and we'll put a Klansman in the White House. And when I started researching this book, I said, that's preposterous. I no longer think that. Now, this is what's great, and Steve, you may have encountered this because we both troll in the past and look for these gems. You know, we're both time travelers, which is what I call historians. And one woman, seemingly with no power. Now, she was, Madge Overholzer was a woman of her age. She liked to party. She went to college. Only 4% of women went to college in the 1820s. She went to Butler College. And she drove across the country with another woman on her own, which is a very daring thing. She was a woman of her age. She was a sort of socially liberated woman. She was a school teacher, one of the few jobs that women could get. And then she was the head of the state literacy program. And her job was on the chopping block. And the only way to save her job was to go 12 blocks from her house to the mansion where D.C. Stevenson lived and beg him to have the state save her state job. And that's where their fates cross. And she ultimately, I mean, I don't want to give away the story because I want you to buy the book.
Oh, I can't go there?
Right, now we can get close, we can get close. There's this horrible thing that happens, and she ends up, her words, I could go this far, that's why, because it's in the subtitle. Mm-hmm. Everyone failed. The press failed. The judicial system certainly failed. The police department failed. Politicians failed. The ministry failed. One of the few opponents of the Klan was the University of Notre Dame, because they were the citadel of American Catholicism. And the Klan had a plan. I saw the document. They were going to drop a bomb from a biplane on the Golden Dome. And in 1924, Stevenson said, there's only one place in this state I haven't conquered yet. Where is it? South Bend. So he sends his 30,000 Klansmen up to basically take over South Bend and flex their power. But the students of Notre Dame, despite what the president told them, had other ideas. So these mostly Irish Catholic kids attacked the Klansmen with potatoes. They're hurling potatoes, and their great quarterback, one of the 4 horsemen, got a direct hit on one of them. And it's a national story. The next day in the Chicago Tribune says, Notre Dame students rout Klansmen like it was a football story. And it gave birth, I swear to God, this has the added value of being true, to Notre Dame's nickname, the Fighting Irish. All because of that. Now, I tell that story to show, ultimately, Catholic Church failed. Notre Dame, they had that one episode. They won the battle. They couldn't bring down the Klan. Who brought down the Klan? One woman, as she lay on her deathbed. That's as far as I'm going.
Testimony?
Well, go ahead.
How much did how much did the Truman Commission do? How much money did they save the country, and how many lives of servicemen?
It's a great question and impossible to answer, but we're trying. And I'm a storyteller and a journalist, not quite a scholar or an academic, but here's the best way I can answer that question. There is no doubt from the few people who've studied the Truman Committee that the number is in the billions, but it's really hard to figure. By the end of the war, and a lot of the work the Truman Committee did, basically what Truman said was he wasn't out to embarrass the military, especially during the war. He wasn't about to embarrass a president. The Truman Committee quickly became very powerful, and Truman picking up the phone to George Marshall in the Army, or Henry Knox, the Secretary of the Navy, often if the Navy or the Army would solve the problem, or if General Motors or United States Steel would fix the problem, no harm, no foul. Truman was perfectly happy for the problem to go away. He writes in his memoirs, I didn't care who got the credit. But as with the Steel Commission, as with North American Aviation, as with the US Navy, if Truman got stonewalled, if the Navy would not answer his responses, if they blocked him or lied to him, okay, Truman had a temper, and then came subpoenas, a public hearing, reporters sitting there, and it was on the front page. Truman was, and part of the fun of this is watching an unknown senator learn how to talk back to the most powerful people in the country and learn how to wield that power. It was really fascinating. So a lot of money was made because Truman or one of his staffers picked up the phone and made a call. How many lives were lost because soldiers didn't drown off the coast of Normandy in June 1944? Impossible to say. They investigated an airplane factory where 300 airplane engines with rust and missing parts were ready to be shipped to the Air Force, to the Army Air Forces at that time, and ready to go into airplanes. And Truman would say these engines were causing the deaths of our student pilots. There's no way to count up those lives lost. How many ships would have broken apart at sea because they were made of bad steel from that steel factory in Pittsburgh? Impossible to say. Truman himself later in life put the number at $15 billion. He would repeat it over and over again. It's probably, as say in the book, it's as good or a bad number as any. It's impossible to say. There's no question the Truman Committee played a big role in saving the taxpayers a lot of money. More importantly, in making sure that soldiers and airmen and sailors and the men and women in the uniform had the equipment and the weapons and the tools they needed to fight efficiently. That, I think, stands probably as one of the most lasting contributions of the Truman Committee. The other thing, Pete, is they invented how to do these congressional investigations. If we follow through to the Kefauver hearings in the 50s, to the Watergate, a lot of the rules for how to conduct these congressional investigations were the groundwork were established by the Truman Committee. They would send the drafts around to Curtis Wright Aviation before they publish their report, and they would allow them to look at it and to correct facts. Witnesses subpoenaed before the committee would be told several days in advance. They would get the chance to read an opening statement. It sounds like small potatoes now, but this was kind of unknown at the time, and many of the press accounts of the Truman Committee commented on how they kind of invented a new way to do these investigations. It was also one of the reasons that Truman also played totally fair with the press. The committee didn't leak. The couple of times that stuff got into the Washington Post, Drew Pearson was the investigative muckraker at the time. Truman was furious. They played fair with the press. And so, by not hyping his reports, by not leaking selected documents, by trying to play the level field and not seeking press, Truman got tons of it. It was one of the reasons that, and one of the things that the committee did was often bringing news to Americans, news that more ships were being sunk in the Atlantic Ocean than anyone knew. News that American fighter planes, the planes that American pilots were taking to the skies were not as good early in the war, I'll say. Were not as good as those flown by Japanese and German pilots. Americans don't like being told that we're now number one, and this was shocking news to people, but it also helped build a level of trust in Truman and his committee that's, again, one of the most lasting contributions.
And he also became president.
And yeah, there's that.
Tim, you don't want to talk about the ending of the book.
I mean, I'll go a little bit there.
How come?
I can do it with mine. Truman becomes president.
The deathbed
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
testimony?
Right. So, but first I just want to say, God, listening to you, Steve, where's that oversight of Boeing right now? I'm sorry, we don't put 4 bolts in the door. We let it go without any bolts. It's the Homer Simpsonization of American industry. Sorry, I just couldn't help thinking of that. Now to this grim topic. Madge gets attacked by Stevenson, and it's a brutal sexual assault, and he also attacks her with his teeth. She gets blood poisoning, and she lays in her bed in Irvington, Indiana for 20-some days. Every day there's this huge headline, Madge lives another day, Madge lingering, Madge wakes up, opens her eyes. And, you know, all these women who Stevenson had attacked were afraid because he said, I'll come get you, I'm the law. She's going back and forth with whether she should do something to bring this monster down. And she's afraid it'll hurt her family. They're working class people. And they decide, with the family's help, to do something. And so over the course of several days, she writes what's called, in legal terms, a deathbed declaration, because she would never be able to be a witness at a trial. So, and it's the story of what happened, what Stevenson did to her, how it all was set up, who the witnesses were, where it happened, what time it happened. All proved out. The investigators went, found the bellboys and all of this stuff. So, the words of a ghost, the words of deathbed declaration, are brought into this trial of D.C. Stevenson. Now, other prosecutors wouldn't bring any cases. There was one, we talked about good people and accidental good people. I mean, one of the amazing things that happened in Indiana during the Klan's reign was black jazz flourished. And Louis Armstrong cut his very first record in Richmond, Indiana, on the exact same day that they had the biggest Klan rally in their history. 40,000 Klansmen turned out in March, and they had a little plane overhead, while Louis and his band are cutting the first jazz record in Richmond, Indiana. It was the only studio between New York and San Francisco. That record went on to sell zillions, and Louis and the boys got out of town just in time, went back to Chicago. Madge was one of the good people, and there was a good prosecutor. There was one prosecutor in Indiana who Stevenson had his dinner. Again, familiar. Every elected public official had to go around at this dinner and swear an oath of loyalty to this monster. The sheriff did this, the chief of police did this, the mayor certainly was a total Klansman. All of them did this. Then they come to what was called a Boyd prosecutor. And he gets up and says, "Thanks for dinner, I'm out of here." He walks out. He alone prosecuted. Now Stevenson cut all his funds off. He didn't pay for the prosecution out of his own pocket. Yeah. But Madge's words, with this one brave prosecutor, put the brakes on this awful history. What would have happened had those two individuals, mainly Madge, as she lay dying, not changed? I gave away a lot of the story.
And then what happened to Mr. Stevenson?
I gave you enough.
I'm with you on that.
But it's just amazing how he was able to manipulate so many people. Same man, yeah.
I mean, okay, I mean, it's all out there, isn't it? It really is. I did not write this book primarily because of all the echoes to today. That's all anyone talks about. I, first and foremost, probably like you, Steve, I look for a good story. I'm a storyteller. And I looked for a good story, and this was a holy crap story. I thought, this is amazing. Lost episode, I didn't know this. Good people, bad people, a monster at the center. And it's all there for the asking. It was all very, very well documented. Transcripts of the trial, all this stuff, all the stuff you look for to bring it to life. But as I'm doing it, I just go, oh my God. The echoes of today, which is extraordinary. You know, and I just don't want to go political because, you know, this is a nonpartisan book festival. I think all human beings of goodwill, regardless of party affiliation,
Would have a similar reaction.
thank you.
Later on, met prosecutor's son.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, so two really cool things happened. This happened recently, but you write these history books. It's old enough. The Dust Bowl book, I was lucky I had people who were still alive.
They're all dead.
Women in their 90s, literally in their last days, and I would gather with them these little tiny towns that all just spring from the map. And we'd gather in a circle and we'd tell these remarkable stories. And I would be weeping at the end. It was so great. But, you know, as soon as the book came out, most of them all passed. Everyone in this book was gone. So I'm dealing with dead people and I'm trying to bring it to life. And when I was in Indiana, this guy comes up to me, blue collar guy, he's wearing his, you know, dairy uniform or something. He says, I live in Madge Oberholzer's house. I said, wow. And because I live in a place where homes are expensive, I said, do you mind how much I asked how much you paid for it? It's a beautiful craftsman and paid for 200 grand, got it, you know. Which in Seattle now you can't buy a garage for that. I said, well, that's remarkable. He goes, we have a little shrine to Madge. And he said, people now, since your book came out, probably every other day, they stop and they want to, oh, this is where Madge Oberholzer lived. And sometimes he invites them inside. It's really cool. He's honoring that legacy. And the other thing is that prosecutor I mentioned, I met his grandson. Yeah. And he came up to one of my readings, and I said, your family, you guys are great Americans. I said, that's what's so cool. He's a Republican, salt of the earth kind of guy, crew cut, and he just said, you know, we knew a little bit about what Grandpa did, because there were death threats against him. Even after they got a conviction, they tried to kill him, tried to kill the prosecutor. So people said, I'm going to get that guy. But I was able to tell his story at the ceiling. So
I spent a lot of time over the last couple of years, late night, on Zoom. All the people in my story were dead. One woman who was a lawyer in Washington in 1940, which is very, very famous. So of course she was hired to work at the Truman Committee as a secretary. But she later went on, she lived to be 100 years old. Her name was Marion Toomey Baker. She lived to be 100. After the war, she passed the bar in Virginia. She became a pro bono family aid lawyer. At one point in the 80s, they announced they were having financial troubles and they were going to cut back. And there was a younger attorney who was going to get laid off. Marion Toomey said, no, I'll go. And allow the other person to keep her job. But then she just kept coming to work every day. For the next 20 years, well into her 80s. When she died in 2016, I was already doing the research on this story in an informal way, and it really broke my heart that I didn't get to meet her. But I spent a lot of time on the Zoom calls with her 3 children late into the nights, and they were happy to share materials or everything. It was by far the richest part of the whole story, was getting to know the children and grandchildren of some of the people I was writing about. It was really fun.
Do we have time for questions?
No.